Hello there, welcome back to the Closet Historian. Today I just have a quick little sewing tutorial tip sort of video for you. This is a really simple little sewing thing, but I just thought I would share how I do this particular thing, which is to finish the raw edges inside of a garment, or finish the raw edges of pieces, the cut edge of fabric before I sew things together. Of course, if something is going to be contained inside of a lining or inside of a facing, inside of binding later, then I don't bother to finish the edges, because as long as something is covering them or finishing them, then they won't fray too much and I won't worry about it. But if I'm going to have like the raw edges inside of an unlined garment or something like that exposed, I do like to either serge them, bind them with rayon seam binding, or bind them with bias tape. So those are the little three things I'm going to show you how I do, and let's jump right in. Okay, I've just got some cotton sateen cut out into little squares so I can show you how I do these seam finishes. This first one's just going to be serging the edges. Super simple if you've got a serger around, of course. And you just put the cut edge right at the edge of the presser foot here on the serger and just serge that raw edge. You can do this on a curve, you can do this on a straight, you can do whatever shape you need. Again, just lining up the cut edge that you need to protect from fraying, and then just serge along. Of course, you can change the thread to match if you would like, but if it's going to be on the inside, it won't show. It doesn't really matter. Then, of course, you just pin your pieces together like you would normally, and then just sew them with your seam allowance. Usually I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's what most patterns call for, or 5/8 seam allowance, but here I am just sewing that along, and I'm even being a good girl and remembering to take the pins out, which sometimes I am bad and will sew right over them. And I have broken needles that way, but I am lazy, as we know. So you just sew the seam as usual, and then when you go to iron it open, it's all nice and finished for you, like so. And you can just iron your seam open, and then it will look nice and finished with those serged edges. Of course, it's not super historically accurate to have serged edges, but I feel, again, if home seamstresses had sergers, they would have used them. Let's be honest. So that's what a serged seam looks like on the inside. I do use this for most of my projects, unless the fabric is too delicate to work on the serger, in which case I do use something like this finish, which is a seam. The edges are bound with rayon seam binding, and I will link an Etsy shop that sells this rayon seam binding in the description. This is just, I've chosen a brighter red one here, just so for the contrast while I'm doing this demonstration, but you can choose one that matches the color quite well because they have many colors. And so I just iron or cut pieces to the size I need, iron those, and then I'm going to iron this in half. I'm just going to pinch this in half like this to create like a little fold to cover the cut edge. So I'm just going to fold and iron that here. Rayon seam binding like this is really nice. You can see how flowy it is, so it's really good for doing on things like rayon challis or rayon crepe or silks, using on things like that you might feel are too delicate to use the serger on, or just want a more couture kind of finer finish. That's what rayon seam binding is really good for. Of course, it is the most finished and prettiest looking of the finishes I do on the inside for sure. So if I'm doing a really nice garment or making something for someone else, I will usually do rayon seam binding like this. All right, so once we have those ironed and folded, we are just going to use those on the edges of our sample pieces here. Again, this will curve quite well around a either concave or convex curve, actually, which is nice. So you just lay the raw edge inside that little fold you just created, and then pin to make sure that stays that way until you can get it over to the sewing machine. You don't really have to pin this that much, actually, if you're working on a straight edge. If you have lots of curves, then pin away, but you really don't need this many pins just when you're lining it up. You can line them up over sitting at the machine once you get used to doing this, I guess. And over here on the sewing machine, basically what I'm doing is lining up the very edge of that folded rayon seam binding with the edge of the presser foot, and then I'm just moving the needle over a little bit on top of the rayon seam binding. So I'm just doing that by adjusting this dial here on my machine. I'm just moving the needle over so that it just catches the edge of that rayon seam binding, and then I'm just going to sew along that using the edge of the presser foot as a guide. You'll notice I don't sew this super straight. Again, I'm just kind of doing this as a sample for you guys, so I'm not super taking my time or anything, but you get the idea, you know what I mean? And then once you have both edges of those, you can of course sew the pieces together, just like you would, just like we did when we were serging it. So once you have both edges bound, I suppose, you just sew your seams as you would normally, or whatever your instructions call for, And then once you press your seam open, it will be all nice and have bound edges like so. If you have obviously matching thread and matching seam binding, this is even a nicer finish, but of course I'm using contrasting ones and then going kind of fast to show you guys. This last little finish here is something I use often on like hemming sleeves or the hem of like skirts too as well. And that is just to use bias tape. This is store-bought bias tape in cotton, just from Joann's. But you can, of course, make matching bias tape like I was doing in that video I posted earlier this week when I was making the striped blouse. You can make bias out of, or cut strips of bias from whatever fabric you are using as well if you would like to have it match exactly. So I'm just going to sew a piece of bias right sides together here. This is on the right side of the fabric. And so you just sew that with, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And I'm trying to, again, be good and not sew over my pins. Look at me. Okay, so now that's on the right side. Of course, this will be turned inside and then like kind of hemmed with a hand stitch in a minute here. But you can also add a row of edge stitching onto this bias as well to help it lay even nicer. So I'm going to do that now. Again, you're just going to position the needle to be just where you would like it. Here I have it just on the inside of that original line of stitching. You're just stitching that bias down even flatter. So we're just going to do a line of stitching here as well. Okay, and then you can see that's on the right side here, and we're just going to turn that over onto the inside, and then we're going to press this down. We have those 2 lines of stitching, so it should lay quite nicely. So of course, just go ahead and iron or press or steam or whatever you need to do this down nice and flat, so you can see that raw edge is totally encased in that bias tape. Then I'm just going to pin this as if it were a hem or the hem of a sleeve, what have you, and then we will hand stitch this bias tape or this bias facing down. I'm just going to come up through the bias tape here with a piece of doubled thread on a needle, and I'm just going to take a tiny little stitch here of the fashion fabric, or the outside, basically the part that will show. It's just going to be a tiny little stitch here, just a little bite of fabric. And then the next stitch, I'm going to go back into the fold of the bias tape, which is hard to do while you're trying to get it on camera, but I'm just kind of slipping the needle back into the fold of the bias tape there. And I'll take a bigger stitch here, usually about a 1/2 inch or a little bit less, like a centimeter, and then another tiny little bite of fabric. And you want to keep these stitches pretty evenly sized, both the small ones and the large ones. That way it has a consistent appearance on the finished front. But I'm just going to do that all the way along here, and then cut that thread off. And then the inside will look like this, nice and enclosed, and the outside will have these little stitches, which of course, again, if you are using a matching thread, are much less noticeable than this, of course. So that is the last way that I use bias to encase edges. So that's how I like to finish my raw edges of things when I'm making sewing projects apparel down here in the sewing room. Of course, there are many ways to deal with the raw edges and do seam finishes. There are thousands of seam finishes probably when it gets to like being couture level things, but these are just the methods that I use the most, so I thought I would share them with you guys in case any of you are new seamstresses out there and just are curious or are just curious about how I make things. This is just how I do it, of course, and there are many ways to do things. This is just my way. But thank you guys, as always, for tuning in today. If you have specific sewing techniques or sewing questions, feel free to leave those in the comments below, and I'll see if I can try and put a video together for you guys or put things on the list of things to do in the future. And thank you, as always, for tuning in today. I'll see you again soon. Bye. Yeah, maybe, kind of. Sometimes it's just hard to get your victory rolls completely even. You know, it's not easy, guys. This is what the back looks like. I don't know how it's holding up. My hair's so short that it's not really the easiest to get it into something like this, but let me guys know if you want a tutorial on this hairstyle. And remember, my hair is quite bobbed. And yes, I did still manage to get into this, so if you would like a tutorial on this style, let me know. Something over here is shaking. No. Everybody behave.